So, there's a walled garden at Highgrove that almost nobody outside the immediate family has ever actually walked through. And I mean the real garden, not the parts they show on the guided tours for charity donors. It's the section Charles started building back in the late 1980s, long before he was king, long before most of us were paying attention to what he did with his weekends. And for almost 4 decades, that garden operated under one very specific legal structure, a private trust set up quietly that controlled not just the land itself, but the ongoing funding for its maintenance, its expansion, and eventually whoever would inherit the responsibility of keeping it alive after Charles was gone. For years, everyone close to the family assumed they knew exactly how that would play out. Camilla would inherit stewardship of it, the same way a spouse typically inherits stewardship of a shared home and its grounds. That was the expectation. That was, by most accounts, what Charles had led her to believe for the better part of 2 decades. And then this year, Charles signed an order that erased all of that in a single afternoon. Not slowly, not through some drawn-out legal negotiation. He signed a document transferring the entire Highgrove Trust, the land, the funding structure, the long-term stewardship rights, everything directly to William. And by every account that's circulated since, Camilla wasn't just surprised. She was devastated in a way that people around her say she genuinely didn't see coming, even after years of watching power inside this family quietly shift away from her at almost every turn. So today I want to walk you through exactly what this trust was, why it mattered so much more than most people realized, why Charles made this decision now, of all times, and why the way he told Camilla might actually be the most telling part of this entire story. And I mean, once you understand the full sequence of what happened here, I think you'll see why people inside the household keep describing this as one of the most quietly brutal decisions Charles has made since becoming king. Let's start with the basics, because I think a lot of people hear Highgrove and just picture a nice house in Gloucestershire, and that's really underselling what this place actually represents inside the institution. Charles bought Highgrove in 1980, before he'd even married Diana. It wasn't a crown property. It wasn't inherited. He bought it with his own money as a private individual, which matters enormously here because it means everything that happened to that estate afterward wasn't subject to the same rules that govern Crown Estate land or Duchy of Cornwall property. Highgrove has always existed in this strange in-between category, royal in every practical sense, but legally, structurally, a private holding that Charles has had almost total personal control over for the past 40-plus years. And the garden specifically became something much bigger than landscaping fairly early on. Charles has talked about it publicly in bits and pieces over the decades, how he essentially built it as a kind of personal philosophy made physical. Organic growing methods before organic was fashionable. A formal Islamic-inspired carpet garden, a woodland garden, an entire arboretum of trees he planted himself, many of which are now 4 decades old and, frankly, irreplaceable in the sense that you cannot simply relocate a 40-year-old oak tree and expect it to mean the same thing. This wasn't a house with a nice lawn. This was Charles's actual life's work, expressed through soil and roots and decades of patient cultivation, long before anyone called him king. There's also a financial dimension here that people tend to overlook, and it's worth walking through because it shapes everything that comes after. Maintaining a garden of this scale and complexity isn't cheap. We're talking about specialized staff, ongoing organic soil management, seasonal replanting schedules, and the kind of continuous hands-on horticultural expertise that doesn't come from hiring a general groundskeeper off the market. Charles built an endowment structure specifically to fund all of this in perpetuity so that whoever inherited stewardship wouldn't have to personally bankroll the garden's survival out of their own pocket, which means whoever controls the trust doesn't just inherit dirt and trees. They inherit an entire ongoing operation with its own budget, its own staff, and its own decision-making authority over how the place evolves going forward. Now here's where the legal structure comes in, because this is the part that actually matters for understanding why this transfer hit the way it did. Back in the early 2000s, and I want to be precise about the timing here because it matters, Charles established what's internally referred to as the Highgrove Estate Trust. This wasn't just a will provision saying, my house goes to whoever. It was an active trust structure, meaning it had its own funding mechanism, its own board of trustees drawn from people close to Charles's household, and its own set of governing rules about who could benefit from the estate, who could live there, who could make decisions about its future, and critically, who would eventually inherit control of the trust itself. And when Charles married Camilla in 2005, the trust's documents were quietly amended. According to people with knowledge of how the estate has been managed since then, that amendment specifically named Camilla as the intended beneficiary of long-term stewardship, contingent on her surviving Charles. Not full ownership in the sense of being able to sell it, nobody was ever going to let that happen, but stewardship, the right to live there, to maintain the gardens according to Charles's original vision, to essentially serve as the keeper of what he'd built for the remainder of her life, with the expectation that it would eventually pass to William afterward once she was gone. That was the arrangement. That was what Camilla understood to be true for roughly 2 decades. 20 years of assuming that whatever else happened inside this family, whatever titles shifted, whatever public criticism came her way, whatever awkwardness lingered around her place in Diana's story, Highgrove was hers, settled, documented, not up for renegotiation. So why did it change, and why now? The honest answer starts with something that happened almost 18 months ago, quietly, inside conversations most of the public never heard about, Charles's health situation. I don't need to relitigate everything about that here because you've probably followed the broad outlines already. But what matters for this specific story is what his diagnosis apparently triggered inside his own thinking about legacy, about what happens to the things he cares about most after he's no longer able to personally oversee them. And according to people close to the household, Charles became increasingly preoccupied, in a very specific way, with Highgrove's garden specifically. Not the house, not the furniture, not the art, not the more conventional markers of inheritance that usually dominate these conversations. The garden. Because gardens, unlike houses, require active, continuous stewardship to survive. A house can sit empty for years and still be a house when someone finally opens the door again. A garden like the one Charles built cannot. It requires someone who actually understands the philosophy behind it, the specific organic methods, the deliberate design choices, the reasoning behind why certain sections were planted the way they were, or within a decade or two, it simply stops being what he built. It becomes something else, something diminished, tended by people who never understood why any of it mattered in the first place. And here's the uncomfortable truth that apparently started weighing on Charles as his health situation became more serious. Camilla, by most accounts, has never shared his specific passion for the garden's organic philosophy in the way he does. She's supportive of it. She's spent decades living alongside it. But the deep, almost obsessive dedication to the specific methods and vision, the thing that actually keeps a project like this alive across generations, that's never really been hers. It's always been his. And increasingly, as Charles started thinking seriously about what happens after he's gone, he apparently began to worry that leaving the garden to Camilla's stewardship, however loving her intentions, might not be enough to actually preserve what he'd spent 4 decades building. William, on the other hand, has reportedly developed a much deeper interest in the specific environmental and agricultural philosophy behind Highgrove over the past several years, partly through his own environmental initiatives, partly through simply spending more time there as an adult than he did as a child, and partly, people close to him suggest, through a genuine desire to understand something his father cared about so deeply for so long. Whether that interest is as profound as Charles's own lifelong devotion to the place is, frankly, something only time will prove. But it was apparently enough to convince Charles that William, not Camilla, represented the better bet for actually keeping the garden alive in the way he intended. So Charles made a decision. And the decision was to restructure the entire trust, removing Camilla's stewardship rights entirely and transferring full control, immediate control, not contingent on anyone's death, directly to William. Now, I want to slow down here because the mechanics of how this actually happened matter enormously, and they tell you a lot about how Charles has been thinking about his own mortality and his own legacy over these past many months. Restructuring an established trust isn't simple. It's not like rewriting a will, where you can just draft a new document and have it take effect upon death. A trust that's already active, with named beneficiaries and established governance, requires formal legal amendment while the person establishing it is still alive and of sound mind to execute the changes. Which means Charles didn't just quietly decide this in his head and let it take effect automatically later. He had to actively, deliberately, formally sign an order amending the trust's core structure, removing one specific beneficiary and installing another in her place, while he was very much alive to do it, and while Camilla was very much alive to feel the consequences of that decision immediately, rather than after his death, when she might have at least had the comfort of grieving him first, before losing this too. That detail, more than almost anything else about this story, is what people close to the family keep coming back to, because Charles could have waited. He could have left the current arrangement in place and simply revised his own personal will to redirect things after his death, the way most people handle these kinds of legacy decisions. Instead, he chose to make the change now, while he's still alive, which means Camilla didn't just lose a future inheritance she was expecting. She lost something she still, in a very real sense, currently had. The stewardship wasn't a distant hypothetical for some point after Charles was gone. It was an active arrangement, and now suddenly it isn't. And when you understand why he apparently made that specific choice, to do it now, while he's alive, rather than let it happen automatically later, the picture becomes even more complicated, and honestly, more sympathetic to Charles in a strange way, even as it becomes more painful for Camilla. Because according to people with knowledge of his thinking on this, Charles wanted to be present for the transition. He didn't want William inheriting the garden cold after Charles's death, having to figure out the specific philosophy and methods from documentation and second-hand accounts. He wanted years, however many he has left, and given his health situation that's clearly weighing on him constantly, actively working alongside William, teaching him directly, walking the grounds together, explaining why this section was planted this way and why that section uses this specific composting method and why the whole thing was designed around principles he's spent decades refining. He wanted a living transfer of knowledge, not a posthumous one. And the only way to make that possible was to restructure the trust now, formally, so that William would have real, actual authority and stake in the garden's future while Charles is still around to guide him through it, which is in its own way a genuinely moving reason. But it doesn't change the fact that executing it required actively removing Camilla from an arrangement she'd understood to be hers for 20 years, and doing it while Charles is still alive, which means she has to live alongside that loss in the same house for however long he has left, rather than processing it privately after he's gone. So let's talk about how she actually found out, because this is the part that's genuinely hard to hear, and it's the detail that seems to have affected people around the family most deeply once it became known. Camilla, according to accounts from people close to the household, wasn't informed of the decision through a private conversation beforehand. She wasn't sat down and walked through Charles's reasoning, given the chance to understand it, to process it, to maybe even offer input on how the transition could work in a way that honored both her existing relationship with the estate and William's growing role in its future. Instead, she reportedly learned about the change the same way the trust's other administrative stakeholders did, through the formal documentation itself, once Charles had already signed it. The legal order was already executed. The decision was already final. What she received wasn't a conversation, it was a notification. Now, I don't think Charles necessarily intended this callously. From what's been described, the decision was handled through his private office, largely for legal and procedural reasons. Trust amendments of this nature require specific formal documentation processes, and there were apparently concerns about maintaining a clean legal record given the complexity of the existing structure. But intent aside, the effect on Camilla was the same regardless of the reasoning behind the process. She learned that her husband had permanently, formally, irreversibly removed her from an inheritance she'd believed was hers for 2 decades. And she learned it the way you'd learn about a change to a business contract, not the way you'd hope to learn about something this personal from someone you'd been married to for that long. People close to her describe her reaction as somewhere beyond simple upset. Devastated is the word that keeps coming up, and I think it's worth sitting with why that specific word fits here, rather than anger, rather than resentment, rather than the kind of fury that might characterize a more straightforwardly adversarial family conflict. Because this wasn't really about losing property in a financial sense. Camilla has never needed Highgrove's garden for financial security. She has more than adequate provisions elsewhere within the broader arrangements of her marriage to Charles. This was about something much more personal. The loss of a role she'd spent 20 years understanding as part of her identity within this family. She wasn't just going to inherit a garden. She was going to be the keeper of something Charles loved more than almost anything else in his life, the person entrusted with preserving his legacy in the most literal, physical sense, soil, trees, decades of careful cultivation. And in a single afternoon, without warning, without a conversation, that role was simply taken away and handed to someone else.
There's also, according to people who understand the dynamics here, a deeper sting layered underneath all of this, which is the specific choice of William as the recipient, rather than, say, keeping the trust structure neutral or finding some kind of shared arrangement. Because William isn't just anyone. William is Diana's son. And while I want to be careful not to overstate this into something more dramatic than what's actually been described, there's an undeniable symbolic weight to Charles choosing Diana's child, specifically to inherit stewardship of the most personal, most private project of his adult life, over the wife who has stood beside him for the past 2 decades. Whether Charles intended any symbolism at all, and by most accounts, he genuinely didn't, this appears to have been a purely practical decision about who shares his passion for the garden's specific methods. The optics of it, from Camilla's position, are difficult to separate from that history. I think it's worth pausing on that specific detail a little longer, actually, because it's the part of this story that seems to generate the most quiet discomfort among people who've watched this family for decades. Diana never lived at Highgrove in any meaningful sense. By the time Charles had truly transformed it into what it became, their marriage was already effectively over. So there's a strange, almost poetic irony sitting underneath all of this. The garden Charles built, in many ways, as an escape from the pressures of his marriage to Diana, is now being handed to Diana's son, while the woman he actually built a life with afterward is the one being asked to step aside. Nobody involved in this decision has framed it that way publicly, and probably wouldn't want it framed that way at all. But it's difficult to look at the sequence of events and not notice it. Now, William's role in all of this is worth examining carefully too. Because I don't think this is a story about an ambitious son maneuvering to take something from his father's wife. By every account, William didn't request this. He didn't lobby for it. He was, apparently, somewhat taken aback himself by the scope of what his father decided to hand over and by the timing of it. William has reportedly expressed to people close to him that he understands exactly how difficult this must be for Camilla, and that he has no interest in publicly celebrating or drawing attention to the transfer in any way that might amplify her hurt, which tracks with a broader pattern we've seen from William over the past couple of years, a consistent instinct to avoid making these institutional power shifts look like victories, even when they clearly represent significant consolidations of authority moving in his direction. But here's the thing about institutional shifts like this one. And I think this is actually the bigger story, hiding underneath the personal family drama. This is not an isolated decision about a garden. It's part of a much longer pattern that's been unfolding steadily since Charles's health situation became public. Piece by piece, decision by decision. Authority that used to sit entirely with Charles has been migrating toward William, not through any dramatic public announcement, but through exactly this kind of quiet individual transfer. A trust here, an estate management decision there. Patronages that get renewed under William's name instead of being automatically assumed under Charles's office. Each one, on its own, looks like a small administrative choice, but stuck together, over roughly 18 months, they paint a very clear picture of a monarch actively, deliberately preparing to hand over as much practical control as possible, while he's still alive, to guide the transition himself, rather than leaving it all to happen abruptly after his death. And Camilla, more than perhaps anyone else in this family, has found herself on the receiving end of that pattern in ways that keep compounding. Because unlike William, who gains authority with each of these transfers, and unlike Charles, who at least retains the dignity of being the one making the decisions himself while he's still king, Camilla occupies a strange, precarious position in all of this. She married into an arrangement built around the assumption that she'd eventually inherit certain forms of stewardship and a status as Charles's widow. But as more and more of that stewardship gets redirected directly to William, while Charles is still alive, specifically to ensure a smoother transition for the next generation, Camilla finds the ground shifting under her in real time, well before she's even had to face the reality of eventually losing Charles altogether. I think that's actually the most quietly devastating part of this entire situation, if you step back from the specific details of trees and trusts and legal amendments. Camilla isn't just losing a garden, she's getting an early, painful preview of exactly how much of her expected future role within this family is going to be reshaped, redirected, and in some cases entirely removed. Well before she ever has to confront widowhood itself. Every one of these transfers is, in a sense, a small rehearsal for a larger loss that hasn't even happened yet. And each time it happens, it seems to land not as an isolated disappointment, but as confirmation of a pattern she apparently didn't fully anticipate when she agreed to this life in the first place. There's a specific moment, according to people close to the household, that captures just how much this has shifted her day-to-day reality at Highgrove. She reportedly asked, fairly recently, about approving a minor change to one of the garden's outer beds. Nothing dramatic, just routine, seasonal maintenance, of the kind she's overseen dozens of times over the years without a second thought. And she was informed, gently but unmistakably, that decisions of that nature now require sign-off through William's office. Since the trust restructuring placed all operational authority over the grounds under his stewardship going forward. A woman who has lived at Highgrove for 2 decades, who has walked those paths more times than anyone alive, suddenly needs permission to move a flower bed. That's not a story about money or property. That's a story about waking up one morning inside your own home and discovering you're now a guest in it. So let's talk about how Charles has handled the aftermath, because this is where his own conflicted feelings about the decision become most visible, even though he said almost nothing about it publicly. People close to him describe a man who remains completely convinced the decision itself was correct, that preserving the garden's future required exactly this kind of decisive, immediate action, and that waiting until after his death would have risked losing decades of accumulated knowledge and philosophy that only he can actually transmit while he's still capable of walking those grounds himself. He hasn't second-guessed the substance of the decision at all. From what's been described, what he has apparently struggled with is the manner of its delivery. The fact that Camilla learned about it through paperwork rather than through him directly, sitting across from her, explaining his reasoning face to face, before the ink was already dry. And in the weeks since, Charles has reportedly tried to compensate for that in small, somewhat awkward ways. Spending more time with Camilla, specifically at Highgrove, even in areas of the garden now technically outside her formal authority, involving her, informally if not legally, in some of the walkthroughs he's been conducting with William. As if trying to signal that even though the paperwork says one thing, her presence and history there still matters to him personally. Whether that's landed the way he intends, or whether it feels to Camilla like a consolation prize for something that was taken from her without warning, is harder to say. But people close to the couple suggest the atmosphere at Highgrove has been noticeably different since the transfer became final, quieter, more careful. The kind of tension that exists in a household where everyone knows something significant has shifted, but nobody quite wants to say it out loud. So, where does this leave Highgrove itself? Practically speaking, from what's been described, Charles and William have already begun spending time together in the garden in a way that's notably different from before. Less social, more instructional. Charles, apparently walking William through specific sections, explaining planting schedules and composting philosophies, and the reasoning behind design choices made decades ago, long before William was even born. It's being described by some close to the family as almost a formal apprenticeship, compressed into whatever time Charles has left to give it properly. Camilla, for her part, has reportedly continued living at Highgrove, as she always has. And nothing about her day-to-day life there has visibly changed on the surface. But the legal reality underneath that continuity has shifted permanently, and everyone involved knows it. even if the garden looks exactly the same from the outside as it did a year ago. Charles, meanwhile, has said nothing publicly about any of this, which is very much in keeping with how these institutional transfers tend to be handled quietly, through legal documentation rather than announcements, allowed to simply become fact without ceremony or acknowledgement. But people close to him suggest that the decision has weighed on him more than he's let on, precisely because he understands what it cost Camilla to have it happen this way, even as he remains convinced it was the right call for preserving what actually matters to him about the place. It's a strange position for a king to be uncertain enough of a decision to execute it immediately and irreversibly, while still carrying real discomfort about how much pain that decision caused someone he loves. And that tension, I think, is really what this entire story comes down to. Not a simple villain and victim narrative, not a straightforward power grab, but something messier and more human, a man trying to secure his own legacy while he still has time to do it properly, making a choice that he believes is right for the thing he cares about most, while causing real, lasting hurt to someone he's spent 2 decades building a life alongside. Charles got the garden's future the way he wanted it. William gained the stewardship of something genuinely significant, both practically and symbolically, years before he ever expected to. And Camilla is left holding the knowledge that even within her own home, even within an arrangement she believed had been settled for 20 years, nothing in this family is ever quite as permanent as it appears. Not until the paperwork says otherwise. And sometimes, not even then, until the day the paperwork actually changes. Because if this pattern tells us anything, it's that these transfers aren't finished. Highgrove was one specific trust, tied to one specific piece of land that mattered enormously to Charles personally. But the broader machinery of authority, moving from Charles to William, hasn't stopped. And by every indication we've seen over the past year and a half, it isn't going to stop anytime soon. Which means the real question isn't whether something like this happens again. It's simply which piece of the institution gets quietly restructured next, and who finds out about it only after the signature is already dry. And if you've been watching how these patterns unfold across this family over the past several months, you already have a decent guess about where the next one lands, because it's never really about the object itself. It's about who still has the power to decide what happens to it, and who's quietly losing that power one signature at a time.